Morning, Harvest Assembly. This is Pastor Clay here. I hope we find you in good spirits this morning. Welcome to our service, our message for Sunday, April 19th, I think. Days are kind of bleeding together during this time of staying at home, and so I hope that you're keeping your sanity and that you know what day it is without having to look at a calendar or necessarily, but we hope we find you a good time this morning. As we're about to get into our service for this morning, our message for this morning, I just want to encourage you, if you're watching this on a Sunday and you're a part of our church, keep using this time before you watch this video to maintain that act of worship, whether that's having almost a live worship set in your living room with your family by playing live videos from a TV or streaming from YouTube, or just putting on quiet worship reflective music on a CD player or a tape in the background, whatever you use for that. But we encourage you to continue using this time before the message as a time of worship and a time of physically rendering to God thanks and praising Him and continuing in that song as we normally would as a church. And if you're not watching this on a Sunday or you're not a part of our church regularly, welcome. Thank you for watching. We're glad to have you participating with us. Just a couple announcements before we get into this morning's message. If you are a part of our church and you regularly give, we are encouraging you to continue to keep giving, please, through email, or sorry, not through email. Don't send it through email. I don't think that'll work. Through snail mail, through an envelope in the mail, or if you need to drop it off in person, you don't trust the mailing system or whatever, we can do that for you using social distancing rules. We are doing a count sometime this week, so make sure that you drop that off before Tuesday morning. Tuesday would be the 21st, so make sure that those tithes and offerings, any giving that you want to do is dropped off for this week before then. And if you miss it, we can still make sure that it gets here and that we'll do another count at some point this month too, I hope. And with that, I think that's our last announcement. So we are starting a new series today for the next couple weeks that's called From Beginning to End. This series is, we're going to take a look at a pretty famous story from Scripture, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So, I know a lot of us are finding, if you're like me, you're finding a lot of spare time during the stay-at-home order, especially in Michigan right now. Finding a lot of spare time to use for just kind of passing that time away. Either you're working outside, or maybe you're finding new avenues to entertain yourselves, or connecting with family, or calling loved ones, whatever that may be. But a lot of us, I know, are spending a lot of this time just passing the time away with movies and entertainment and TV shows. A lot of times, especially if you're like me, the best TV shows, the best movies, the best stories that we hear, maybe it's even a novel, maybe it's a book series or something like that. But these best stories, the ones that are the most memorable, that keep us on edge the most, are the ones that you have to wait to see the meaning by the end. You have to wait all the way to the end of that movie, all the way to the end of the book or the TV show, the very last episode, to really get what the meaning is. That they kind of entice you coming back. Every episode ends on a cliffhanger, or every chapter ends with some new development, or the movie is at a pace where you're not sure where everything is going. It reminds me of a story, a movie by the director Christopher Nolan called Memento. I don't know if you've seen it before. I remember the most, or you've heard about Memento before. Basically, the story of Memento is this man named Leonard is trying to get revenge on his wife's killer. And all he can remember about his life is the very few moments leading up to his wife's death, his wife's murder. And since that moment, he's not been able to form any new memories. And so Leonard has all these kind of crazy details that he's pulling up about what he's supposed to be doing. He's got tattoos all over his body with facts, and he's got this Polaroid camera, and he writes notes to himself because he can't form any new memories. And what's really interesting beyond just that plot, that line of story, is how the movie is moving forward in Leonard's story. The very first scene that you see of the movie is actually the very last thing that happens in the timeline of the movie. The very first scene is the last scene. And then the very second scene is the very beginning of Leonard's story where we meet him. And the movie progresses in this way where it goes from these two very beginning and end points, and then kind of cuts back all the way to the very last scene of the movie. The very last thing that you see of the movie is the very middle of Leonard's story and what happens. And in that story, it's the very event, the very scene that unlocks the rest of what's going on. Some of the best movies or books or TV shows work this same way. You might know what's going to happen at the end. Maybe you've seen Sixth Sense. I know, what's the director? I can't remember his name. Pastor Nicole's looking at me in the background and she can't remember his name either. He directed a movie called Sixth Sense. I think you've heard of it before. M. Night Shyamalan, that's him. His movies are classic for having this twist, especially with Sixth Sense. You might know the end from the beginning if it's been spoiled to you, but even then, when the end is spoiled, you see hints drop along the way. And even if you've seen or read or watched one of these stories before, you might know the end, and you're looking again on the second time, the third time, the fourth time for clues that are dropped all along the way, foreshadowing clues that are dropped of the big twist, the big reveal. So in this next series that we're giving, this series called From Beginning to End, we wanted to start a series based on a narrative, based on a story very much like the one I'm describing. We had some other series in mind that maybe we were going to plan for this time, around this time of year and this season, and with the stay at home and changing up how church is looking, we wanted to save those for a different time. So we're going to be in this story for the next couple weeks, and we hope that this story brings a vibrance to your faith and a reflection to your faith and your walk during this time as a collective church together. So, this new series, we're talking about a story that you know the end from the beginning. Narratives like this are all over Scripture. They're everywhere over Scripture, especially the Old Testament. These narratives have this same idea that you might know the end from the beginning, but all along the way, all throughout the story, from the very beginning to the very end of the story, whoever story it is, all of these stories have the same universal meaning. God is sovereign over the story of his people. God is sovereign over our stories. You might know that verse in Revelation where it talks about Jesus being the Omega and the Alpha, or the Alpha and Omega, the beginning of the Greek alphabet and the end of the Greek alphabet. That is called an inclusio. What that means is that Jesus is the beginning and the end, but not just the beginning and the end, but he's everything in between the beginning and the end as well. This same idea is true for this story that we're going to be getting into in the next couple weeks. So if you have your Bibles with you or whatever app you're using, we're going to be in Genesis 37 this morning. I'm going to be reading portions of this so you can kind of follow along. It's a lot to read, but I want to go through the beginning of this story, this family, and get a good idea of what's going on in setting this stage for the beginning of this story. So, Genesis 37, we're going to start in verse 2. I've got my Bible right here. I hope you got yours. Genesis 37, 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak a peaceful word to him. Skipping down now to verse 18. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come, now let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, and throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Now, skipping ahead to the very end of this chapter at verse 32. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put a sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Yes, we are going to be in the story of Joseph. I know this is a story that you probably know pretty well, especially if you're a part of our church, and if you've been maybe in church for a long time. You know this story. This story is a classic from the Old Testament, right? It's a classic tale full of deceit, full of betrayal, dreams and visions of the future, famine, and all the while God making a nation from a tiny family of people, normal people. We often focus, especially in this beginning of this story, on what happens to Joseph as well. Because Joseph, well, he's the main character, right? That's kind of who we're following. But Joseph's story is really not just about Joseph. It is about Jacob. Joseph's story is Jacob's story. And really, Jacob's story is Jacob's story of his family, right? This isn't just about Joseph, but it's about Joseph, all of his brothers, their father, and in their entire household. Jacob's family, this story, is really about, as well, a story of a nation from beginning to end. We have to know this because this is how the story was recorded. This is why the story was recorded. I know last week, the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, I was kind of filing through some of our stuff here at the church, and I found an old VHS box set of the movie. I think there's like 4 VHS tapes of this movie. I'm not sure how long the actual movie is, but it seemed pretty long to have 4 tapes of it that we still have at the church. And to be honest, I haven't seen all of the movie before, but I was watching a little bit of it last week. But it was reminding me, especially because Easter time, which was last week, we talk about Passover, and the Ten Commandments begins with that understanding of what Passover was and a nation that God chose in bondage. In the Ten Commandments, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is right after Joseph's story is done, we see a nation of people in the Ten Commandments, that story, get liberated by God from Egypt. This nation is the end, the prolonging after 400 years in Egypt, is the culmination of Jacob's family. Jacob actually gets renamed in the Old Testament, if you know anything about his story growing up, and he receives the name from God, Israel. Does that sound familiar? That's because it's the nation that God chose, right? Israel is the chosen nation. If we're going to read this story about Joseph, which is really about Joseph's family, we have to read it like it was told, knowing the end from the beginning. We know where this story heads, because we know the story of Exodus. We know the story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt, right? We know that God at some point takes Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household, the rest of it, named Israel, to Egypt. And this is the story of how that happens. Growing up as an Israelite, if we were Jewish growing up thousands and thousands of years ago, when we were reading this story or hearing this story for the first time, we know some of our background as a nation, right? We know that we were in Egypt at some point. We know that we were in bondage. We know there was some of these really important people way, way, way back. But we're waiting to hear the details of that. That's kind of how we're arriving at Joseph's story. It's not really a spoiler to know that he ends up in Egypt or know that his family becomes a nation in Egypt. But rather, this story highlights something really important. That God is sovereign in Jacob's family, in Joseph's family, from the very beginning to the very end, and everything in between. He is the author of the story of his people, and he is sovereign over their story. He is sovereign over Joseph, he's sovereign over his brothers, and he's sovereign over Israel as a nation eventually coming to be. So week by week, as we're going through the story, we'll continue to add into the story, kind of like a series, like a TV show, different episodes that we see in Joseph and his family, and eventually culminating in God's robust and just miraculous, spectacular, really, conclusion of Joseph's family. So as we read, I want to adopt also a new perspective as we go about the rest of this morning. Especially in this first chapter, in chapter 37, we see Joseph kind of highlighted as the main protagonist, right? That Jacob, it says these in the very beginning in verse 2, it says these are the stories of Jacob's family, right? These are the generations of Jacob. And then right away it introduces Joseph. But giving a little history, we kind of know what's going on beforehand, but we also want to adopt a new perspective. Because usually when you're a child in Sunday school or you've taught this story to kids, you usually tell it from the perspective of Joseph, right? He's the main character. That's who we're following, right? But I want to adopt a different perspective for today. That maybe we're used to reading the story and putting ourselves in the feet of Joseph. Joseph goes through a lot of crud. We've read about that already, and we'll talk about that later too. He goes through a lot of bad stuff. But I want to posit to you that maybe we should be reading this story from the perspective of Joseph's brothers. Think about the people who would normally be reading this story. Young kids, Israelites, parents telling their kids or talking about the story again and dissecting it, or rabbis retelling the story. The things we learn from this story are not just from Joseph, but we learn actually what it means to be God's people, looking at what happens to Joseph's brothers and what they do during this time, especially at the very beginning and the very end when it culminates in bringing everything back together and wrapping it up. So, reading from the perspective of Joseph's brothers, he's got 11 brothers that we know about at this point. Especially in today's chapter, let's get into this story. So, first in this story, in this beginning episode, we see their problem, the problem that the brothers have. Jacob's sons have a new problem develop in their life. And to understand this problem, the way this narrative turns and winds, we have to begin with the patriarch of the family. That patriarch, as we've said before, is Jacob, is the man named Israel. Jacob's character is much just at fault for the way this story goes as anyone else's. We have this reminder that I want to give you that Jacob is God's chosen servant. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, and he is God's chosen servant. Remember, his name is Israel. This is his nation. From his family, the 12 tribes of Israel come, right? This is an important person. But if you know anything about Jacob and his history, he's an awful guy. He just does some terrible stuff. Just a quick history of Jacob's story growing up, right? Jacob is the youngest of 2 sons, and at some point, he cheats his brother and lies to his father to steal his brother's birthright. That's terrible, right? What an awful person. Remember, this is God's chosen servant as well, right? Jacob then leaves because he's scared of his brother, and he marries not 1 woman, but 2. And the problem there is that he marries sisters. I know some people in the Old Testament, David and Solomon, had a lot of wives and a lot of women in their life. And maybe 2 in the perspective of Solomon's 1,000 women, I think he had. 2 isn't really that bad. But sisters, come on, dude. Like, seriously, is that really the best option for your life? It was a different time back then, I know. But Jacob doesn't just marry sisters, but he also pits them against each other because he can't help but just be this very crummy guy. He, first of all, says that one of the sisters is his favorite, and he chooses one over the other. Then his uncle, Laban, tricks him into marrying the one that Jacob didn't want to marry. So any good person at this point, any stand-up guy at this point, would try and do his best to give the good life to both of these people and the rest of their family, right? That's what the good thing would be to do, right? That's not what Jacob does at this point. He chooses one over the other, and he chooses their kids over each other. He ends up having one favorite wife and one wife that he tolerates, and their sisters, by the way, if I haven't said that enough already. And between these 2 wives and their servants, Jacob then has 12 sons. He has daughters too. 12 sons. All from 4 different women. That's not a great, things aren't getting better, right, for Jacob's story. He then cheats his uncle for money and profit, leaves his uncle's house, and then meets up with his brother again and is scared because he's cheated his brother, right? Who's Jacob not skimming from and not stealing from at this point? And then before he meets up with his brother, he dares to go into a wrestling match with God himself. Who is this guy? He's nuts. The ensuing events of Jacob's life, of Joseph's life, are the direct result of what Jacob has done, of the choices that he has made. His entire family is built on this premise of favoritism even. He loves one wife the most, he loves one son the most, and he never tries to hide any of it. All of Jacob's family, all of the turmoil with his sons and everything that happens to Joseph is kind of the culmination of Jacob's own life choices. So we have Jacob. I hope you have a good idea of who Jacob is. Next we have Joseph. Joseph is the protagonist of this story, right? He's the main character. We follow Joseph this whole time. But in Joseph's story, right away, we are introduced to him as this talkative, arrogant, immature, unwise, boastful kid that you just want to get rid of, That he just sounds like a wonderful younger brother, right? I have a younger brother. I'm actually the oldest of my siblings. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And I can tell you, my little brother, I love him, and he's nowhere. I would trade anybody else to have Joseph as a younger brother. I would just get rid of. You don't want that as a younger brother, right? Immature, unwise, boastful kind of kid, and he talks about it all the time. That's not the kind of kid you want to have. But here's the point. Even though Joseph is kind of this arrogant young kid that's the center of everything in his father's family. We know Joseph is important. In case you didn't catch it or you don't know Joseph's story at all, in this chapter he gets 2 dreams from God. And he reminds the viewer, the audience, and his whole family of what these dreams consist of. That he sees himself at some point rising above his brothers, his mother, and his father, that all his family would bow down to him. Who is this punk kid that God chose to be a leader of his family? And at this point, too, I think it's clear to remind you, God, in an unnamed manner, reminds the audience, even though we see who Joseph is, he reminds the audience that Joseph is important and that he's going to be working through Joseph because God gives him these dreams. Even though he tells them in a terrible way, even though he's not the person that he's supposed to be right now, God reminds us that Joseph is important. Lastly, we have the characters that we're seeing the story from, the brothers. Remember, this story is not just as much about Joseph or Jacob as it is just as much about the brothers of this family. And just quick as a reminder, we know their character in this story and in stories past. We haven't seen stories from all of the brothers, but we get stories of Reuben, who slept with one of his dad's wives, one of his dad's concubines. We get stories of Simeon and Levi, Reuben's younger brothers, that murder a whole town because their sister was taken advantage of. And we see eventually stories from Judah, another brother, that he just does some terrible things as a head of his own household. He's just these are some awful people, right? And they developed this problem. Their problem has a name also, and their problem's name is Joseph. They have their own faults and their own issues, but at this point in the story, we are shown how much they hate their brother. Actually, in the story, if you read the beginning of chapter 37 all the way to the end, I think it says 4 or 5 times in the book how much they hated him, just to remind you the difficulty there. We know that their problem has a name, and it's Joseph. But we also know, from greater perspective, their problem isn't really Joseph. Their problem is themselves, their own brokenness, their own sinfulness. Their problem, they think, is Joseph, but the problem that they have is really just their own broken humanity and their hatred and their failure. So secondly in the story, we see the solution that they give to their problem. Their solution is taking care of Joseph, their problem, that they think, right? Joseph he's this arrogant little brother, and he is the eye of his father. He's the golden child of his family. And if they get rid of Joseph, they think that everything will be back to normal and that they can be in their father's good graces again. And all of their past failures will be resolved by this one solution, getting rid of the younger brother, right? And in this solution, they actually come up with 3 solutions. Their first solution, kill Joseph. Not a great first solution, right? Murder your younger brother. Joseph in this story is asked by his father to go visit his brothers. And we know the first time that he's done this in this story, he actually rats them out. Whatever they were doing that their father didn't want, that they didn't want their father to know about, it says right in verse 3 in chapter 37, if you read it, Joseph gives a bad report to his father about his brothers, and they hate him for it. So now we find Joseph again coming to visit his brothers while they're working. What do you think he's going to do here? As a brother, as someone who's seen Joseph's previous character, what do you think he's going to do? You doubt letting Joseph go, right? You can't let him go because he's already ruined enough things. So they devise to kill him at this point. And even before he arrives, even before they say a word to him, Scripture says that they premeditate and they decide they're going to get rid of him and kill him. That's their first solution. The second solution, the eldest brother speaks up, Reuben, and he says, wait. We don't have to kill him. Maybe we can just throw him in a pit and take care of him that way. That way we don't actually have to do the dirty work, but we just leave him there. But unbeknownst to his brothers, Reuben is devising a second scheme, not just to kill his brother or let his brother die of exposure, but rather Reuben has his own plot to rescue his brother, Joseph, and return him back safely to his dad. Remember, Reuben screwed up royally at this point, and he needs to get back in his father's good graces. What better way than to blame the rest of your brothers and deliver your father's golden child back to you safe and unharmed? Reuben has his own scheme, and that scheme, his solution for his problem for Joseph, is to save him, right? But the problem is that Reuben's just as guilty, he's just as selfish, he's just as exploitive as his other brothers are. Then the third solution comes up. Maybe we don't murder Joseph. Reuben goes away he steps aside for a second, so his solution goes to put Judah at this point suggests another option. Maybe we don't murder him. Maybe we don't just let him die. That seems kind of dirty, and then we have to take care of things. Maybe we just sell him into slavery, and he can just be gone forever at that point. That way we know our brother's alive the last time we saw him. We're not responsible for what happened to him at that point. We can just get rid of him that way. Rather than deal with that mess, Judah suggests this idea of selling Joseph into slavery, which at this point, being a slave for these kind of people that they see, the Ishmaelites, that they're going to sell to Egypt, that is not the life you want to live. That's a life of oppression, of exploitation, of no freedom, and no hope for the rest of your life. This is the solution that they choose to get rid of their problem, to solve their problem. And the idea here is that none of these very human, very faulty solutions solve their true problem. They think their problem is Joseph, but really their problem is their own brokenness, right? Getting rid of their younger brother doesn't solve anything, and it's a very human way to try and solve a very human problem. At this point, their very human solution to their problem brings a final scene, the aftermath.